measuring migration through population censuses. Throughout their lives, some people never change the place where they live, while others may change it few or many times. These moves, also known as migrations, have an impact on population size and distribution and affect the economy of both origin and destination locations. For these reasons, they are of interest to policymakers. Historically, migration has had a significant impact on many countries, and it continues to do so. This presentation highlights the opportunities that the census provides in collecting information on migration. The Conference of European Statisticians adopted in 2006 a set of recommendations for the 2010 round of population censuses. This document represents the main standard that countries in the ECE region will use for the next round of censuses. The ECE region includes the countries of Europe, North America, Central Asia, and Israel. The recommendations include some census topics that are indicated as core, which means that they should be collected by all countries. This presentation will focus on the core topics on migration, but also other non-core topics on migration will be covered. It isn't likely that any country will be able to include all these topics, but depending on national priorities, the inclusion of core and some non-core topics will enable countries to obtain a good picture of all population groups related to international migration and their integration, as well as on internal and international flows of migrants. From the perspective of a given country, migration can be within the country, and this is known as internal migration, or between countries, and this is known as international migration. International migrants can be of two types: immigrants who are people entering the country to become usual residents, and emigrants who are people who are to leave the country to take usual residence in another country. It is important to note that the statistical concepts of immigrants and emigrants are not linked to the legal status of migrants, who should be enumerated regardless of their legal status or documentation. It might appear to be relatively straightforward to count and to gather information about immigrants in a population census when the census is intended to count people resident within the country. However, it is extremely difficult to count immigrants without proper documentation because of their fear of involvement with government authorities. Emigrants are difficult to measure in a population census as they are no longer living in the country. As a consequence, most countries measure immigration in their census, and only a small number have attempted to estimate emigration. Depending on the questions that are asked, internal migration can be measured in the census. However, because of the reluctance of undocumented immigrants to participate in a census, this estimate of internal migration may well be undercounted. We will now start discussing international migration. Information related to international migration may refer to stocks or flows of migrants. In broad terms, stocks of migrants refers to the people who live in a country at a specific point in time and who have previously experienced at least a migration event. Flows of migrants refers to the movements of people who migrated during a specified time period. The census can be a good tool to produce estimates of the stocks of migrants. With respect to flows of migrants, the census can provide data only on a limited period of time before the census. There are three different stocks of migrants which are of primary interest for studying migration. They are the foreign-born, the foreigners, and the ever-international migrants. In each country, data on the stock of immigrants are used to monitor the size and composition of these population groups. With this information, assessments can be made on the integration of immigrants into the social and economic fabric of the host country. It is important, then, to specify clearly how these population groups are defined and how they relate to one another. We will now discuss how each of these groups can be defined and measured in a census, according to the recommendations of the CES for the 2010 round of population censuses. It should be noted that in the CES recommendations, the topics that allow identifying the three population groups are core topics. The foreign-born are those persons who were born in another country. These persons have experienced at least one international migration in their life, for instance from the country of birth to the current country of residence. From an analytical and policy perspective, the foreign-born may be, on the one hand, too broad a concept because a portion of foreign-born people is composed of nationals of the country. On the other hand, this concept may be too restrictive, since it excludes children born to immigrants. A question on place of birth allows the identification of the foreign-born population in the census. For the foreign-born, the country of birth should be recorded. Some problems may arise for persons born in countries that no longer exist, such as the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia. For these persons, the country of birth should be specified on the basis of borders existing at the time of the census. This provides information on current country boundaries and assures international comparability. It should be noted, however, that some respondents will not want to answer on the basis of new boundaries, and others may be hesitant to point out their place of birth for fear of reprisal. Special attention should be paid to these issues in the training of census enumerators. Foreigners are those persons who do not have the citizenship of the country where they reside. Citizenship is defined as the legal bond between a person and a state which has been acquired by birth or by naturalization. The group of foreigners is particularly important from a policy perspective, since policies on entry and length of stay in a country are directed at non-nationals. In order to identify the foreign population, a question on citizenship should be included in the census. For foreigners, the country of citizenship should be recorded. Individuals may have one or multiple citizenships, or none, and the question should allow for all these cases to be properly identified. It is important that the respondents understand the difference between citizenship and nationality. Citizenship refers to legal bonds, while nationality refers to ethnic affiliation. The stock of ever international migrants is the set of persons who have ever changed their country of usual residence. In order to be consistent with the recommendations on statistics of international migration, this group includes persons who have lived in another country for at least 12 months. The group of ever international migrants includes persons with very different migration histories. Among the groups of ever international migrants, countries may have a specific interest in nationals that have resided abroad and then returned, the so-called returned citizens. The main objective for identifying the group of ever international migrants is to study their integration in the country. The group of ever international migrants can be identified in a census through a question on whether a person has ever resided abroad. This question needs to be asked of everybody, irrespective of their place of birth and citizenship. It is advised that countries collect, for those who ever resided abroad, additional information on the year of arrival in the country of residence. This information allows calculation of the duration of residence, an important element when studying the integration of migrants. For a more accurate measurement of the duration of permanence in the country, the month of arrival should also be asked. This information can also be used to estimate flows of international migrants. For migrants who experienced multiple migrations and moved their residence in the country more than once, the information on the year and month of arrival should refer to the last arrival in the country rather than the first arrival. The three groups of stocks of migrants defined so far, foreign-born, foreigners and ever-international migrants, are not mutually exclusive and they can overlap to a great extent. This can be visually represented in a chart. In a population, we can distinguish first between native-born and foreign-born persons. Then we can identify the foreigners with a blue line. Some of them can be foreign-born and some can be native-born. Finally, we can identify with a red line the ever-international migrants. All foreign-born persons are ever-international migrants because they change their country of residence at least once in their life. Some native-born persons may also be included if they lived abroad for some time and then returned. The experience of many countries that receive relatively large numbers of immigrants shows that challenges to the integration of immigrant communities can be long-lasting, affecting not only first-generation immigrants, but also their descendants. For this reason, more and more countries are interested in collecting data on the descendants of foreign-born. This group, also called second generation, includes all persons born in the country whose parents were born abroad. Countries may choose to include in their census questions about this population group, depending on their national priorities. To identify the descendants of foreign-born, a question on the country of birth of both parents is needed. An alternative way to identify descendants of foreign-born is to use a question on citizenship acquisition. This will enable the identification of those persons who were foreigners at birth and eventually acquired citizenship through naturalization. The group of descendants of foreign-born can be visually represented in the diagram of the main population groups relevant to international migration presented before. At this level of detail, the population is divided between persons with native-born parents and persons with foreign-born parents. The descendants of foreign-born are represented in the green area. The diagram shows the overlaps that can occur between the various groups and does not represent the relative population sizes. In fact, most persons within a country would normally be counted in the top left quadrant, being native-born with native-born parents. The country of birth of the parents is presented in the CES census recommendations as a non-core topic. Other non-core topics that countries may consider to collect additional information on related to migration include country of previous usual residence abroad, total duration of residence in the country, place of usual residence 5 years prior to the census, reason for migration, citizenship acquisition. Groups of persons such as refugees, asylum seekers, or illegal, irregular, or undocumented migrants are sometimes excluded from the census. One of the major questions of interest to all census takers is the extent to which these persons are not included. One of the reasons is that they are difficult to enumerate. However, in accordance with the CES census recommendations, all persons meeting the condition to be considered usual resident, residing in the country for 12 months or more, should be counted in the census regardless of their legal status. Therefore, it's important that countries make all possible efforts to cover in the census all migrants regardless of their legal status. In some regions, these migrants constitute a significant proportion of the population, and as they use public services such as healthcare or education, they should be counted in the census. Although measures can be taken to enumerate undocumented immigrants, it is still a challenge to encourage those persons to participate in the census operations. We've been talking so far about international migration. We will now see how the census can be used to collect information on internal migration. Information on internal migration flows can be collected through the question on the year and month of arrival in the current place of usual residence, as well as on the previous place of usual residence. Such questions would provide full information on geographical and time patterns of internal migration. An alternative way to collect information on internal migration flows is to inquire about the place of usual residence at a fixed time prior to the census, usually 1 year. This question can also provide good data on internal migration flows, although it will be limited, of course, to the selected time period. In examining internal migration flows, it is important to define the smallest geographical area that is to be considered. These vary from country to country, depending on the size and population. To make sense of internal migration patterns, countries need to establish a classification that will distinguish between local, intra-regional, and inter-regional moves. The collection of information on internal migration, based on the year and month of arrival in the current place of usual residence, or on the place of usual residence 1 year prior to the census, is recommended as core in the census recommendations. So far, we've been talking about immigration and internal migration, relatively easy topics in a census, as the persons concerned live in the country and therefore can complete a census form. A small number of countries have also attempted to measure emigration through the population census. The main reasons for wanting to do this is to establish how many people have left the country, why they left, where they are, how long they've been away, what is their profile, whether they intend to return, and whether they still have economic ties in the country of origin. There has been limited success with this topic. It is difficult to locate those who have left the country, and even more difficult to obtain information from them. It is also better to focus on those emigrants who have left their country only fairly recently, say in the last 5 years before the census. Emigrants who have been living abroad for 12 months or more must be excluded from the count of resident population, and information on them should be collected in a separate module. To conclude this presentation, the census represents a unique opportunity to improve the availability and quality of information on internal, and in particular, international migration. Compared to other sources, the census can provide a comprehensive picture of the size and characteristics of stocks of migrants.